20, page 376. With this, their comrade rode off in his motor car. In the wretchedly poor settlements of the Kolyma near Yagodnoya, for instance, Retz recalls that there were women who were not allowed to go to the mainland, yet the MVD forbade exiles to marry them. Families would have to be given accommodations, but not allowing exiles to marry could also be a concession. In northern Kazakhstan in 1950-52, some MVD posts tried to tie the exiles down by confronting new arrivals with this stipulation: marry within 2 weeks or we'll send you into the interior, into the desert. It is a curious fact that in many places of exile the camp turn general duties was used quite straightforwardly, not as a joke, because that was what they were, exactly the same as in the camp, the necessary heartbreaking jobs which ruin a man's health and do not pay a living wage. Although the exiles, as free men, were now supposed to work shorter hours, 2 hours there to the pit or to the logging section, and 2 back for their working day up to the camp norm. The old worker Berezovsky, a trade union leader in the 20s, who had endured 10 weary years of exile from 1938, only to be sentenced to 10 years in the camps in 1949, tearfully kissed his camp ration in my presence and said happily that he would not perish in the camp where he had a right to bread. As an exile, even if you go into a shop with money in your pocket and see a loaf on the shelf, they may look at you brazenly in the eye and say no bread, and sell to a local while you watch. It is the same with fuel. The old Petersburg worker, Civilko, and there is nothing namby-pamby about any of these people, expressed very similar sentiments. He said in 1951 that after exile he felt like a human being again, and in a special hard labor camp he worked his 12 hours and went back to the huts, whereas in exile the merest non-entity among the free population could order him, he was a bookkeeper, to work unpaid overtime in the evening or on his day off, or could call on him if he needed any sort of job done privately, and no exile would dare refuse, for fear of dismissal next day. Nor was life sweet for the ex-prisoner who became a trustee in exile. Mitrovich was transferred to Kokhterek in the Dzhambul Oblast. This is how his new life began there. He and a companion were quartered in a donkey stable, which had no windows and was full of dung. They raked the dung away from one wall, made themselves a bed of wormwood, and lay down to sleep. He was given a job as livestock specialist in the district agricultural department. He tried to serve honestly, and at once fell foul of the free men in the district party leadership. The local petty officials were in the habit of taking cows newly in milk from the kolkhoz herd and replacing them with heifers. Excuse me. They expected Mitrovich to register 2-year-old animals as 4-year-olds. When he began taking stock carefully, he discovered whole herds which did not belong to the kolkhozes, but were fed and tended by them. It turned out that they were the personal property of the first secretary the district party committee, the chairman of the executive committee of the district Soviet, the head of the local tax office, and the militia chief. Excuse me. Kazakhstan had taken the comfortable road to socialism. Just don't put them on the list, they ordered him, but he did, with a zeal for Soviet legality quite bizarre in an exile and ex-prisoner. He even ventured to protest against the appropriation of grey Astrakhan by the chairman of the executive committee. He was dismissed, and that was only the beginning of hostilities. Still, even a district center is not such a bad place of exile. The real hardships of exile began where there was no semblance of a free settlement beyond the fringe of civilization. Ace Vilko, again, tells us of the Ch03's new life, Kolkaz, in the western Kazakhstan Oblast, where he was from in 1937. Before the exiles arrived, the political section of the machine and tractor station had warned and indoctrinated the locals. Trotskyites and counter-revolutionaries are on the way. The frightened natives would not lend the newcomers so much as a bit of salt, in case they were accused of associating with enemies of the people. During the war, exiles had no bread cards. Our informant worked in a kolkhoz smithy for 8 months and earned a pound of millet. The exiles themselves milled the grain. And they milled the grain they received between grindstones made from a sawn-up Kazakh monument. Some went to the NKVD and asked either to be jailed or to be allowed to move to the district center. Some may ask, what about the natives? Well, they're used to it, and if you have a sheep or two, a goat, a cow, a yurt, some crockery, it all helps. In the Kolkhoz, exiles are always badly off. Excuse me. No regulation clothing, no camp ration. There's no more dreadful place in exile than the Kolkhoz. It is a kind of field test, where it's life harder in the camp of the Kolkhoz. Here we are at a sale of new exiles. S.A. Lifshitz among them at the Krasnoyarsk transit prison. The buyers ask for carpenters, and the prison authorities answer, take a lawyer and a chemist, Lifshitz, as well, and we'll give you your carpenter. Some sick old women are added as make-weight. Then they are all taken on open lorries in a mild 25-degree frost to a village deep in the woods. A village of 36 households in all. What can a lawyer do there, or a chemist? Here's an advance to be getting on with: a sack of potatoes, some onions, some flour, a generous advance at that. Money you'll get next year if you earn it. Your work for the time being is getting the hemp from under the snow drifts. At first, there isn't even a sack to stuff with straw or to use for a mattress. Your first impulse is to ask to be released from the Kolkhoz. No, it can't be done. The Kolkhoz has paid the administration of prisons 120 rubles a head. This was in 1952. If only you could go back to the camp again. But the reader will err if he concludes that exiles were much better off in state farms than in collective farms. Take the state farm at the village of Minderla in the Sukhobizm district. There are rows of huts with a boundary fence, it's true, so that it looks like an open prison camp, although it is a state farm. Money is unknown, and there is none in circulation. Instead, they put down meaningless figures, 9 rubles, Stalin rubles, per man per day. They also put down how much gruel a man has eaten, and how much should be deducted from his padded jacket and the roof over his head. Deduction after deduction is made until, surprise, when the final account is drawn up, the exile has no wage to come, but on the contrary, is in debt to the state farm. A. Ch03 recalls that 2 people at this farm hanged themselves in desperation. Ch03 himself, a visionary, had learned nothing from his ill-fated attempt to study English in Steplag. When he had taken a good look at his place of exile, he thought he would exercise the constitutional right of a citizen of the USSR to education. So he applied for leave of absence to go to Krasnoyarsk and study. On this impudent application, the like of which the land of exile had probably never seen, the state farm manager, a former Raikom secretary, penned something more than a negative decision, a solemn prohibition for the future. At no time is Ch03 to be allowed to study. However, a chance came his way. The Krasnoyarsk transit point was recruiting carpenters from the exiles in various districts. Ch03, although he was no carpenter, volunteered, went to Krasnoyarsk, where he lived in a hostel with thieves and drunks, and set about preparing for the competitive entrance examination to the medical institute. He passed with high marks. He got as far as the credentials commission, and still no one had examined his documents thoroughly. I served at the front, he told them, then came back and he dried up, and what? Ch03 came out with it, and then I was put in jail. The commission looked black, but I served my sentence. I am a free man now. I got high marks. Ch03 insisted, in vain. Yet this was the year of Beria's fall. Excuse me, I'm sorry. The more remote the farm, the worse things were. The wilder the place, the fewer the exiles, writes A.F. Mikhaev in his previously mentioned notes on Kangir, cites the story told by Alexander Vladimirovich Polyakov, the slave of Turgai, about his exile to a remote pasture in the Turgai wilderness in the interval between 2 spells in camps. The only authority there was the Kolkhoz's chairman, a Kazakh. Even the MVD paid no parental visits. Polyakov's living quarters were in the same shed as the sheep, on a litter of straw. His duties to the slave of the chairman's 4 wives, help each of them with her chores, and to even empty their chamber pots after them. What was Polyakov to do, leaving the grazing ground and complain? Leave? Apart from the fact that he had no mount, it would have meant attempted escape and 20 years of katorga. There was not a single Russian out there. Months went by before a Russian, a tax official, turned up. Polyakov's story astonished him as he offered to pass on a written complaint to the district center. This complaint treated as a foul libel against the Soviet state earned Polyakov another stretch in the camps, and he was happily serving his time in Kangir in the 50s. To him, it was almost as though he had been released. And we cannot be sure that the slave of Turgai was the most miserable of all exiles, nor can we say without qualification that exile, as compared with imprisonment in a camp, has the advantage of providing a cellular existence. This is where you live and this is where you will live, with no fear of transportation. Transports or no transports, an inexplicable and inexorable police order transferring you elsewhere, or the unexpected closure of a particular center or of a whole district to exiles is an ever-present threat. Our informants recalled such cases in various localities over the years, especially during the war, when vigilance was a watchword. All exiles in Taipak district must be ready within 12 hours, and off you go to Batinsk, your wretched home, your goods and chattels, so pathetic, and to you so precious. The leaky roof you've just mended, leave it all, forget it. Quick march, you sturdy beggars. You'll scrape it all together again if you live long enough. Although life looked so free and easy, they didn't march about in columns, but went each his own way. They did not line up for work assignments. They did not doff their caps. They were not locked in for the night. Exile had its own disciplinary code. It was more severe in some places than in others, but it made itself felt everywhere until 1953, when the general relaxation began. Excuse me. In many places, for instance, exiles had no right to address complaints on civil matters to local government bodies, except through the MVD command post, which alone decided whether to let them go forward or snuff them on the spot. Whenever an MVD officer summoned him, the exile had to leave his work undone, drop whatever he was doing, and report. If you know the ways of the world, you will not need telling that no exile would refuse to carry out a blackmailing personal request from a post officer. The officers in MVD command posts enjoyed a position and rights scarcely inferior to those of officers in camps. Indeed, they had much less to worry about. No restricted area, no guard roster, no hunting runaways, no escorting prisoners to work, none of the business of feeding and clothing a crowd of people. It was enough for them to tick off each name twice a month, and occasionally initiate a case against those who had broken some rule as required by the law. They were despotic, they were lazy, they were self-indulgent. A second lieutenant's pay was 2,000 rubles a month, and so for the most part, malevolent creatures. Escape, properly so-called, from Soviet places of exile was almost unknown. The successful escaper would not gain very much in terms of civil freedom. The local free population, living all around him, had after all much the same rights as himself. These were not Tsar's times, when flight from exile easily passed into emigration. Besides, the punishment for running away was no light matter. Escapers were dealt with by a special board. Before 1937, it handed out its maximum sentence of 5 years in prison camp, and from 1937, 10 years. And from 1937, 10 years. After the war, however, a new law, unpublished but universally known, was invariably applied. The inordinately cruel penalty for running away from a place of exile was now 20 years of katorga. Local MVD posts introduced their own interpretations of what should or should not be considered an escape attempt, drew for themselves the forbidden line which the exile must not cross, decided whether or not he could go off to gather firewood or pick mushrooms. In Khakassia, for instance, in the Orzhan-Ikitsevsky mining settlement, the rule was that uphill absenteeism into mountain country counted as a mere breach of discipline punishable with 5 years in a camp, while downhill absenteeism in the direction of the railway was attempted escape punishable with 20 years of katorga. This unpardonable leniency took such a hold on the settlement that when a group of Armenian exiles, driven to despair by the high-handedness of the mine management, went to the district center to complain, naturally without permission from the MBD post to absent themselves for this purpose, they got a mere 6 years for their attempted escape. What were classified as attempts to escape were more often than not misinterpreted absences of this sort. These and the ingenuous mistakes of older people who could not get the hang of our savage system and adapt themselves to it. This one Greek woman, more than 80 years old, was banished from Simferopol to the Urals towards the end of the war. When the war ended, her son returned to Simferopol, and she naturally went to live secretly with him. In 1949, now 87 years old, she was arrested, sentenced to 20 years of hard labor, and transported to Ozerleg, 87 plus 20, a life sentence. Another old woman, also Greek, was well known in the Dushanbe Oblast. When the Greeks were deported from the Kuban, she was taken together with 2 grown-up daughters, while her third daughter, who was remarried to a Russian, remained behind. The old woman lived a while longer in exile and decided to go home to this daughter to die. This one was an escape punishable with hard labor for 20 years. In Ch03, we had a physiologist called Alexander Ivanovich Bogoslavsky. He had benefited from the Adenauer amnesty of 1955, but not in full. The period of exile was left in force, although it should not have been. He started sending appeals and petitions, but this was a lengthy business, and in the meantime, his mother in Perm, who had not seen him in 14 years, since he had gone off to war and a prisoner of war camp, was going blind and longed to see him before her eyesight failed altogether. Risking hard labor, Bogoslavsky decided to visit her and be back within a week. He invented an official trip for himself to grazing lands out in the wilds and boarded a train to Novosibirsk. No one in the district had noticed his absence, but in Novosibirsk, a vigilant taximan reported him to secret police, who asked to see his papers, and since he had none to make and since he had to make a clean and since he had none, he had to make a clean breast. He was sent back to our clay-walled prison in Ch03, and interrogation was underway when suddenly a ruling arrived that he was not to be treated as an exile. As soon as he was released, he went to his mother, but it was too late. He was too late. We should paint a very inadequate picture of the Soviet exile system if we did not recall that in every district to which exiles were sent, an operations department kept unsleeping watch, pulled in exiles for little talks, recruited informers, collected denunciations, and used them to pin fresh sentences on people, for the time was never far off when the isolated individual exile would exchange his monotonous and static existence for the animated congestion of the camps. A second extension, reinvestigation, and a new sentence was for many the natural end of exile. If Piotr Vixnia had not deserted from the reactionary bourgeois Latvian army in 1922 and run away to the Free Soviet Union, had he not been exiled in 1934 to Kazakhstan for corresponding with relatives still in Latvia who came to no harm at all, yet refused to be downhearted. He had not worked indefatigably in exile. Had he not worked indefatigably in exile as an engine driver at the Ayagaza depot and earned Stakhanovite status on December 3, 1937, posters would not have been put up at the depot saying, "Model yourselves on Comrade Vixnia," and on December 4th, Comrade Vixnia would not have been put inside for an extension of sentence from which he would never return. In exile, as in camps, resentencing went on continually to show them up there that the operations department never slept. There, as elsewhere, intensive methods were used to help the prisoner understand his fate more quickly and submit more unreservedly. Civilko was put in the hole at Uralsk in 1937 for 32 days and had 6 teeth knocked out. But there were also special periods, as for instance in 1948, when a close meshed net was cast in all places of exile, and either all exiles without exception were fished out for transportation to the camps, as at Vorkuta. Vorkuta is becoming an industrial center, and Comrade Stalin has given instructions to clean it up, or else in some other places, all males. But even for those who did not land in jail for an extended sentence, the end of exile was a nebulous idea. Thus, on the Kolyma, where release from camp meant no more than transfer from the care of the camp guardhouse to that of the special NVD post, there was, strictly speaking, no end of exile either, because there was no exit from the area. Those who did manage to break away and go to the mainland in brief periods, when it was permitted, probably never stopped cursing their fate. On the mainland, they were all sentenced to fresh spells in the camps. The sky of exile, troubled enough without it, was continually darkened by the shadow of the operations department, under the eye of the secret police, at the mercy of informers, continually working himself to the verge of collapse in the struggle to earn bread for his children. The exile lived a very isolated life, the life of a timorous recluse. There were none of those long, intimate conversations, those confessions of things past, usual in prisons and camps. That is why it is so difficult to collect stories about life in exile. The Soviet exile system has also left almost nothing in the way of photographs. The only photographs taken were meant for documents, for personal departments and special sections. If a group of exiles had their photograph taken together, what could it mean? What it would certainly mean was immediate denunciation to the security authorities. There you are, our local underground anti-Soviet organization. They would use the snapshot to arrest the lot. Exile, in our day, has left behind none of those rather jolly group photographs. You know the sort. Third from left, Ulyanov. Second from right, Khrushchevsky. All well fed, all neatly dressed, knowing neither toil nor want, every last beard tidily trimmed, every single cap of good fur. Those, my children, were very dark times. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.